Good evening, everyone, and welcome to lesson number 4, the last lesson of our Outsmarting Antisemitism course, Change of Heart. So for the past 3 weeks, there is one topic we have been discussing, and that, of course, is anti-Semitism. We have been talking about the origins of anti-Semitism, the psychology of the anti-Semite. We talked about Jews who get involved in anti-Israel activities, which are very much essentially anti-Semitic activities. That's the past few weeks. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more directly as to what do we do about it, right? What should we do when it comes to dealing with anti-Semites? But I want to point out that what type of anti-Semites are we generally speaking talking about? It's very rare that a person is actually going to encounter a full-fledged actual anti-Semite who will speak their mind openly, clearly, and say the words, "I hate Jews." Most of the anti-Semitism that we are going to experience today comes from people who claim they're not anti-Semites. They come from people who their anti-Semitism is presented in a sophisticated package. They have to present it in a way that's legitimate. Yet between me and you, we know it's pretty clear these people are anti-Semitic, and the result of what they do is dangerous. It's harmful for the Jewish people throughout the world. What kind of people are we talking about? First of all, journalists, right? There is a bias in the media that is hard to comprehend on occasion. This week, right, there was a terrible tragedy in Israel. A member of Hamas opened fire at a group of Jews on their way to the Kotel, murdering one 26-year-old, the nephew of Mrs. Landis, the principal of Hill Academy right here in Milwaukee, right? Her nephew, she's from South Africa originally, and injuring 3-4 other people, right? The Israeli police in the area immediately shot and killed the terrorist. A headline in a major newspaper was, "Israel kills Palestinians." That literally was the headline. A Palestinian terrorist shot and killed a 26-year-old and wounded 3 other people. The headline is, "Israel kills a Palestinian," right? There's serious danger to this type of reporting. The anti-Semitism that can be found embedded in the media, very painful and difficult to deal with. We see this among celebrities, people in the entertainment world. They make statements condemning Israel. The war, the last Gaza war, 10, 12,000 rockets are being rained down on Israel, on a daily basis. Yet celebrities, famous people condemning, criticizing Israel as if Israel is a reincarnation of the Third Reich. Politicians, right? I don't have to name the names, but we know who are the people in the United States Congress who are serious anti-Semites. And then, of course, academia. Right? I talked about my experience at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. There are university campuses that are dominated by anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activity. These people play a major role in shaping popular opinion. How do we deal with them? How do we respond? How do we react? Now, as the course is called, Outsmarting Antisemitism. We can't just respond, we can't just react. We have to make sure that ultimately we outsmart the anti-Semites as well. So I want to begin with an example. Got to go back about 50 years, 1970, but really even before that. In the 50s and the 60s, the main supplier of military equipment and weapons to the newly established state of Israel was France. Now, a little bit before the Six-Day War, Israel signed a contract, purchased and actually paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets. The Six-Day War is imminent, and the French government decides we are making an embargo. We are not selling any military equipment to any of the people who are a party to this conflict in the Middle East. So even though that Israel already paid for these 50 Mirage fighter jets, that was denied to them by France. Can you argue it hurt both sides? because they refused to sell not just to Israel, but they refused to sell to Syria and to Jordan and to Egypt and as well. That, of course, is not the case, because all of those other countries were being supplied by Russia. So all of those other countries had all the weapons that they needed. Israel was greatly damaged by France not selling weapons to them. Why did they do it? Perhaps it was because they wanted to look good to Arab countries. They felt that ultimately they will get a lot more business from selling to Arab countries than they're going to off of selling weapons to the Jewish people. Now, in 1970, right, this is after the Six-Day War, right, there was what is known as the War of Attrition. During the War of Attrition, the French president at that time, French Pompidou, he makes an announcement that they're going to be selling 50 Mirage jet fighter jets to Libya. Now, ultimately, it actually was 110. It wasn't 50. And who is Libya? Libya was a staunch enemy of the Jewish people, a very difficult enemy of the Jewish people. So at the same time that France refused to sell weapons to Israel, they are going to sell these weapons to enemies of the Jewish people. Let's go to text number 1. This is from the New York Times. Sam Melton, would you like to read? You can unmute yourself, start us off. Text number 1 on page 116.
The final chapter of Outsmarting Antisemitism addresses the question of responding to...
On page 116, where it says text 1.
Oh, 116, excuse me.
Yes, 116, text 1.
Sorry, that was my fault. I handed him the wrong.
No worries.
Mirage jets to Libya. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting fronts. The French defense minister reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict: Israel, the United Arab Republic, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Israeli fears of the Libyan Mirage is based on the conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force in its present state could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken towards Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel, but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country.
So put yourself in the mindset of a Jew in the year 1970. Fighter jets that you desperately need and even paid for are being denied to you by France. And then they decide to sell these planes to your active enemies. And you know, there is no way that the Libyan Air Force can utilize, can absorb, can take advantage of these planes. And that was 50 planes. The deal was actually 110 planes. You know, these planes somehow are going to be pointed in your direction, and you are denied the ability to defend yourself. 1970, shortly after this happened, the French president, Pompidou, is making a trip to the United States. What should be the Jewish reaction? How should the Jewish people lay out a welcome mat for the French president at this time? Are there things that the Jewish community should do? Are there things that the Jewish community should not do? Now, we're going to revisit this question in just a few minutes. Before we get back to the story and what took place in 1970, we want to know, what does the Torah say? If we want to know what the Jewish perspective is on how to respond to anti-Semitism, there's only one source that we can go to, and that, of course, is the Torah. The story that we're going to look at, we actually just read last week in the Torah. right? This literally is the Torah portions that we're discussing at this time. It's incredible divine providence. What is the story? Esav wants to kill Yaakov, right? Esav wants to kill his brother Yaakov, right? Why? We'll leave that for another time. Yaakov has to run for his life. He runs to Haran to save himself. It's 20 years later, he's married with children, and it's time for him to return back to the land of Israel. But he knows that Esav is going to come after him. He knows there's going to be a confrontation. So Yaakov sends some messengers to go check out Esav and see what exactly is Esav doing. How is he going to respond to me? The messengers come back to Yaakov and they say, Esav is marching towards you with 400 armed men. His anger has not subsided. He wants to kill you. So what does Yaakov do? Yaakov does three things. Number one, he prays. Number two, he sends gifts to his brother. And number three, he prepares for an armed struggle. He prepares for war. What kind of gifts did he send to his brother? The Torah describes that Yaakov at this point in time was very wealthy, and he took large groups of animals, herds, a herd of goats, of sheep, of rams, cows, camels, donkeys. He would gather a nice herd and send it with messengers towards Esav. And then he'd put a serious amount of space, and then he'd put another herd, a serious amount of space, and then another herd and another herd. That way, Esav was receiving gifts of herds of animals as far as the eye can see. As far as I can see, there was an unending supply of animals that kept on coming to him, kept on coming to him, and kept on coming to him. The message that he included with the gift, these gifts are from your servant Yaakov, who wants to make peace with you, who wants to reconcile with you. So after sending these incredible gifts, tremendous amount of money, there was a visible display which was very powerful and would have a huge effect, together with the messages of appeasement, of affection, of reconciliation. Finally, Yaakov, together with his family, his wife, and his children, they appear. Yaakov bows down 7 times and approaches his brother Esav in a most respectful fashion. Now, how do you think that Yaakov felt when he did this? His brother, evil dude, bad guy, as bad as they come. His brother wants to kill him. He's literally there to murder you. And he's got 400 soldiers with him. And he doesn't just want to murder you. He wants to murder your wife. He wants to murder your kids. And what are you doing? You're flattering him. You're giving him gifts. You're trying to appease and mollify and praise him. Do you think Yaakov felt weak at this point in time? How would you feel if you were trying to give all these gifts to your enemy who wanted to kill you and wipe you out? But did he feel weak? The answer is absolutely not. Why did he not feel weak? First of all, he was quite strong and he was ready for war. He was prepared for war. However, what was Yaakov's approach to life? Yaakov's approach to life was, I am in God's hands. All that I need to do is to create space for God's protection. All I need to do is make a vessel for God's blessings to manifest themselves. And perhaps through diplomacy, through giving these gifts, I could avoid conflict, I could avoid bloodshed, I could avoid any violence. Even if you have to go to violence, do you think that has a good effect on your family? That has a good effect on your kids? It's not the optional way to go. Could Yaakov have done it? Yes, he could have. What does he choose to do? He chooses to give gifts, to send messages of peace and reconciliation. He bows down many, many times. What is his goal? He wants to create a space and a vessel for God's blessings. Now, did it work? Let's go to text number 3. Larry, Larry or Karen, would you like to read text number 3?
Sure. Jacob's model.
The text 3, fraternal embrace.
Fraternal embrace. Hold on. Fraternal embrace. Esau ran towards Jacob and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept.
So not only was
Deciphering
there,
the heart.
sorry. So not only was there no violence, was there no bloodshed, but he embraced him, right? They hugged, he kissed him, and they wept together. So in this circumstance, the diplomacy absolutely worked. Now, does this mean that Esav became a changed person? He became a new person. He is now the greatest lover of his friend, of his brother Yaakov, and now they're going to be best friends forever. Is that what happened? No. Was this embrace sincere, or was it not sincere? Let's go to text number 4. Alan, would you like to read text number 4?
Certainly.
Page 120.
The Torah features dots over the words "and kissed him." This is because Esau did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, "It is an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at that time, and he kissed him wholeheartedly."
So this is a comment based on something quite unusual. The words in a Torah scroll do not have any punctuation at all. 0 punctuation. Yet every once in a while, there's a word that's written in the Torah that has a bunch of dots on top of it. The dots that are on top of it are essentially screaming out and calling out for interpretation. This is a view of an ancient Torah scroll. Although I'm not sure why JLI chose to use this image, I would have used a completely different image. But if you look at where it's highlighted over here on top of the word, right, there's a bunch of dots on top of it. If this was a real Torah scroll, you would not see any dots, any lines anywhere on the whole page, except for on the words Vayishikehu, which means and he kissed him. The commentaries say, why are there dots on that word? Because you can interpret the story in 2 ways. Either the kiss was not genuine. For whatever reason, Esau said, you know what? I don't need to kill my brother. War is not going to accomplish anything. Fine. He hugged him, he kissed him, and he moved on in his life. The other interpretation was that it was genuine. It was sincere. Some love was evoked in him at that time. It may have been short-lived, but it was real. But it doesn't matter, because either interpretation, whether you want to say it was a temporary, genuine love, whether you want to say it was feigned love, that's not what's important. What's important to the story is that there was a threat of violence. Yaakov chose the path of diplomacy, and the diplomacy worked. Yaakov did whatever he needed to do, and he got the result of safety and security for his family, and he was able to continue to move on. Throughout history, the Jewish people have used this story as the model for how to judge and how to react and how to engage with anti-Semites. Let's go to text number 5. Text number 5 has is about a 3rd century Talmudic scholar whose name was Rabbi Yanai. Mitchell, would you like to read text number 5 on page 121?
Okay. Which page?
Page
5?
121, text number
Gotcha.
5, diplomatic planning.
The Midrash states, Bereshit Rabbah 78:15, that when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study this approach and to adopt it in actual practice.
So here we have a clear understanding that the model that the Jewish people are meant to use throughout history with dealing with various anti-Semitic people, anti-Semitic regimes, is supposed to follow the model with which Yaakov interacted with Esav. What is this model? What does this mean practically? So first of all, it means that we can and should wield influence over the Esavs of our generation. This is absolutely something that is possible, that we need to do. How should we go about doing it? Well, we'll get that in a second. Through influence, through persuasion, and through this diplomacy. Very often our initial reaction to dealing with an anti-Semite is we want to come out swinging, aggressive. We're angry, we're frustrated. We want to make a huge statement. What the encounter between Yaakov and Esav is telling us, while yes, we can't be stupid and we have to prepare for war and be ready to react with self-defense and violence if needed, but what is our first reaction? What is our initial response? The kinder and more gentle approach of Yaakov. This is our first approach. An example of this approach takes place with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous Rashbi, not only a Talmudic sage, but he is the author of the Zohar, like the foundational book of Kabbalah. He lived in the 2nd century and had a very difficult relationship with the Romans. He was once in a conversation with his fellow colleagues who were praising all of the technology that the Romans brought to the land of Israel. And his response was, I'm not so impressed. The Romans didn't do it for us, they did it for their own benefits. Right? Word got out that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said some negative things about the Romans. The Romans chased after him. The Romans attempted to arrest him. He had to hide for 13 years in a cave because the Romans were out to kill him. Despite the challenges that he had with the Romans, when the Romans officially banned certain Jewish practices, he traveled to Rome in order to negotiate on behalf of the Jewish people. He engaged in diplomacy. That's text number 6. Mark, would you like to read text number 6?
Sure, thank you. The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai go, for he is experienced in miracles.
So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he travels to Rome. He intercedes on behalf of the Jewish people. He makes a positive impression, and thankfully the decrees are annulled. Now, who is this Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? We just mentioned him in a previous text. What did he say? He said, it is an established fact that Esav hates Yaakov. But that was his approach. His approach was Esav hates Yaakov. What does that mean in contemporary times? It means that Rome hates the Jewish people. So here you have a rabbi who his approach to life was, the reality is, there's nothing we can do. The Romans hate us. They're a bunch of anti-Semites. What might you think his reaction is going to be? Would you like to negotiate with these anti-Semites? His reaction was, no. You want me to waste my time? What value could there possibly be in me dealing with these evil, disgusting, repulsive Romans who are persecuting us and making all these laws? But that was not his reaction at all, right? His reaction was, I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Yaakov. I'm going to engage in diplomacy, even with people who hate me, even though I will never change their mind, but perhaps I'll be able to secure some type of concession, some type of benefit for the Jewish people, and ultimately it was actually annulled. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai recognized that sometimes diplomacy can actually get you what you need, and sometimes it can even give you an embrace. Sometimes it can even give you a kiss. Historically, there have been influential Jews, sometimes you might want to call them court Jews, who played this role of intervening on behalf of the Jewish people with the local governments. The technical word for these people is called Shtadlanim. I don't know if you've ever heard this word before. It's called Shtadlanim. If you look at page 123 in your book, there's a really great chart. This is Jewish advocates in Central Europe, the years 1500 to the year 800, and you have a brief little biography of Jews who were influential, who played this role, oftentimes dealing with anti-Semitic regimes. One of the most famous ones is the first one here on the page, Yosef of Rosheim. Yosef of Rosheim, he lived from the year 1480 to 1554, and he was active on behalf of the German Jews. He appealed to the Roman Emperor Maximilian I, as well as Charles V. These people were not lovers of the Jewish people. Charles V, he was actually the grandson of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, rabid anti-Semites who expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492, and then led the Inquisition for centuries to follow. Charles V actually became the King of Spain and actually led the Inquisition, which tortured and murdered a tremendous amount of Jews. Yet when there were issues, the path of diplomacy was the one that was used, and Yosef of Rosheim was able to secure many privileges for the Jewish people and to protect them from various forms of oppression and expulsion. Let's go to text number 7. Craig, would you like to read text number 7 on page 124?
In 1531, the denouncers once again hounded the emperor, Charles V, while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Sivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothright attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from all those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time, and was secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled The Sanctified Path.
So what Rabbi Yosef did was very dangerous, right? He describes how there was a mercenary. His name was Rothroyd, who actively attempted to kill him, and how he had to escape for his life. So what he did was risky, it was dangerous, there was no guarantee of success. And no matter what, there was pretty much zero chance of actually making Charles V to become on your side and to become your friend. Yet that was not his goal. His goal was not to make Charles V a lover and an admirer of the Jewish people. His goal was to ensure the survival of the Jewish people. And through diplomacy, he was able to do so and secure safety and security for the Jewish people. Did this approach always work? No, right? Of course, this approach did not always work. One example, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, who lived in Spain at the time of the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. He was a very wealthy individual. He was a very influential individual, and he appealed directly to King Ferdinand and to Queen Isabella regarding the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. He had 3 meetings, 3 private meetings with the king and the queen, in which he had the ability to plead on behalf of his fellow Jews. But he was not alone. He actually rallied the support of a large number of Gentiles, Spanish Christians, who were on his side, who felt that the Jews should not be expelled. He did not only have the support of many Gentiles, but he had a huge amount of money, a tremendous amount of gold was going to be given to the king in order to save the plight of the Jewish people in Spain. And what happened? It was rejected. This is a painting of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by Emilio Sala Francis, 1889, in the Museo del Prado. This painting is depicting a legend that came out of that story, that the Abarbanel, who you could see here is in the picture with the yarmulke, he's pleading his case on behalf of the Jewish people to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And Torquemada barges into the room. He's right there in the middle, pointing his finger. And Torquemada says to the king and to the queen, Judas sold him for 30 pieces of silver. Now you want to sell him again? And Abarbanel sees all of his diplomacy crumble before his eyes, and the Jews are expelled from Spain. So sometimes this approach worked, and sometimes this approach did not work. It may not work with a Haman, it may not work with a Torquemada, it may not work with a Hitler. But we have to recognize that this is not an approach from weakness. This is a recognition that we need to do what we have to do, right, to create blessings from God. Pleading with an authority, even an authority that is an open anti-Semite, it should not make you feel inferior. If you recognize that you are in God's hands, it's not from a place of weakness, it's not from a place of inferiority. Diplomacy is a method where you could create a vessel for God's blessings and ultimately God's salvation. This was the approach of Yaakov. This was the approach of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This was the approach of Rabbi Yanai. This is the approach of the Abarbanel. And this was the approach of Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim as well. Now, this entire premise that diplomacy can actually work, the premise is that we actually have the ability to make deals and actually get concessions from people who do not like us and from people who actually hate us. How does this actually work? On a practical level, why would a person who is an anti-Semite, why is a person who hates you, why would he negotiate? Why would he grant concessions? How does that possibly work? Now, the answer, of course, is people are complicated, right? People are complicated. Sometimes people say things, but they don't actually believe them. There may be sociological reasons why a person may be saying and espousing anti-Semitic ideas, but they don't necessarily believe them in their heart of hearts. Or there could be a person who really is an anti-Semite. He really does hate the Jewish people. Nevertheless, that person may not be evil. The person might actually be redeemable. The person might have kind and generous qualities that you can appeal to, despite the fact that they're anti-Semitic. So I want to give you an example. There is an actor, you might be familiar with him. His name is Mel Gibson. You heard of this guy, right? Mel Gibson, kind of a famous guy. July 28th, 2006, he is pulled over by the cops in Malibu. He fails a breathalyzer test and he is arrested. He's fighting with the cops. He refuses to go easily. He's handcuffed, he's in the car, and he finds out that the arresting officer is Jewish. And he unleashes a tirade against the Jewish people. Jews are responsible for all the wars of the world, etc., and etc. This is recorded, it's put all over the media, and Mel Gibson is deemed an anti-Semite. He is the model of an anti-Semite. Wicked, evil, human piece of garbage. He's an anti-Semite. He apologizes. He is not a bigot. He is not an anti-Semite in any way. The world laughs at him. As far as everyone is concerned, Mel Gibson is an anti-Semite. Mel Gibson has Jewish friends, and some of them stand up for him. They say, I know Mel Gibson for decades. I've never seen any hint of anti-Semitism from here at all. The guy was drunk. When people are drunk, they say stupid things. Sometimes people like to say that when people are drunk, that's when their real personality comes out. That's when the truth comes out. Maybe sometimes, but quite often people who are drunk, right, do things that are irrational, abnormal, stupid, and who knows where that influence comes from. It'd be very difficult to say that everything that a person does when they're drunk is actually an accurate representation of who they really are inside. So Mel Gibson, is he an anti-Semite? Is he not an anti-Semite? It's an interesting question. Let's go to text number 8a, a scientific perspective on what's going on in the human mind. Karen Melton, would you like to read text number 8a?
Brains are like representative democracies. They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There is an ongoing conversation among the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. When the hostess at a party offers chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts, no, there really isn't. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of the sugar, and other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forego it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is, whether you put your hand up or out. As the French essayist Michel de
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Okay,
Montaigne.
Montaigne, thank you, put it, there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others.
So this is a phenomenal quote. This last quote here, there's as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. You'd like to think that a person is of one mind, you have one personality, you have one approach to life. If you see two different people, you could understand that two different people have two completely different opinions, have two totally different personalities. Two different people can be on the opposite sides of an issue. But you know what? Right? David Eagleman writes here that the same person can be on opposite sides of the same issue because our personalities are complex. We lean in all kinds of different directions. It can depend on the mood. It depends on what kind of breakfast we had that day. It could depend on the environment that we're in as to which direction ultimately we are pulled in. But the same way you could have two other people who are in conflict with each other, that same conflict exists within ourselves on various levels, higher and lower. Text number 8b, right? He continues to explain in relation to Mel Gibson. Could you continue, Karen, text number 8b?
Returning to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade, we can ask whether there is such a thing as true colors. We have seen that behavior is the outcome of the battle among internal systems. To be clear, I'm not defending Gibson's despicable behavior, but I am saying that a team of rivals' brain can naturally harbor both racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a truth serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle toward the short-term, unreflective faction, which has no more or less claim than any other faction to be the true one.
So the big idea that comes out from this text is that people are complex, and there could be in one person a major anti-Semite and a person who's not an anti-Semite at the same time. Now, it's possible that the anti-Semite part of the personality, for whatever reason, plays the dominant role. But because of the fact that there is a non-anti-Semitic element of that person that exists within his personality as well, they can be reached. You can speak to them, you can talk to them. Diplomacy is possible even with people who say they hate you. Is it going to work every time? No, it's not going to work every time. But is it a viable, sensible approach? The Torah says absolutely it is. It might be easier for us to write people off and just to say, this guy's an anti-Semite, I don't want to have anything to do with him. How can I talk to him? How could I speak to him? How could we enter into any negotiation? The Torah says, wait a second. Even people who appear to be quite anti-Semitic, there is the ability to talk, to negotiate, and actually win concessions and actually achieve some measure of safety and security from the Jewish people, from these people, because people are complex. If you go with the approach of calling everyone anti-Semites, right, going with this more negative, angry approach, who knows if that's helpful? Who knows if it's really true? And who knows what the consequences are going to be? If Yaakov's first initial reaction was to say, Esav is an anti-Semite that I cannot deal with, and we're going to react with violence, who knows what kind of death and destruction would have followed? We don't know. If Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai refused to negotiate with the Romans and just called them a bunch of evil anti-Semites, who knows what direction the anti-Semitic decrees and the persecution would have had? If Joseph Rosheim just viewed Charles V as an evil anti-Semite who's not worthy of any conversation, who knows the damage that that might have had on the Jewish people? We have to figure, what is the correct approach? What way could I influence? What way could I persuade? In what way can I actually reach out to and accomplish a goal for the Jewish people? The first response should not be with hate, with violence, with revenge, but with diplomacy. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? I have the ability to read your minds directly through Zoom, right? It's an app that's only for rabbis. It's add-on to Zoom, and we could read your mind. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, diplomacy is a good idea. When is it a good idea? In the past. Why is diplomacy a good idea in the past? Because in the past, on a factual level, we were weak. We were in no position to react with any power, with any strength, with any violence. The Jewish people essentially had zero options. Rabbi Yosef Rosheim, right, in 16th century Germany, had no army to call upon, had nothing that he was able to do other than negotiation. There was no army, there was no power, there was no politicians, there was no boycott that he could have done. His only choice was diplomacy. However, today, in the modern era, we have the option to wage war against our opponents. An actual physical war, or political pressure, or economic pressure through boycotts, protests, demonstrations. We actually have power today. Perhaps today, in the modern era, we need a different approach, not of diplomacy, but perhaps something a little bit more aggressive. While this approach certainly is reasonable, the question is it actually true? From the Torah perspective, Yaakov had the option to fight. He even prepared for it. Yaakov did have his own little army besides just his family, yet he decided to bestow gifts. Even in the scenario, even in Yaakov's scenario, where he had the option to fight first, where he did have the power, he chose not to use it. Diplomacy was his first option. Let's go back to 1970. The French president, Pompidou, who just announced that he's going to be selling 110 Mirage fighter jets to Libya, sworn enemy of the Jewish people. These weapons are going to end up in the hands of people who are actively fighting the Jewish people, yet at the same time refuses to sell any weapons to the state of Israel. He is coming to America. What does the Jewish community do? They greet him with demonstrations, with protests. 10,000 people are outside the hotel in Chicago where he's going to stay and speak. Thousands of people screaming, yelling, posters, engaging with the police, engaging with the security. He's frustrated, he's mad, he's angry, he's furious. Let's go to text number 9, page 131. Karen Bird, would you like to read?
Sure.
Thank you.
An angry president. President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by the jostling that members of his party received from demonstrations in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police.
Now, your reaction to this might be good, right? Let this anti-Semite be uncomfortable. Let this anti-Semite be bothered. You think you can do this to Israel and you're going to show up? We're going to surround you. We're going to scream. We're going to shout. We're going to boo. We're going to make you feel very uncomfortable. Let this guy feel the heat. While this might be emotionally satisfying, but what's the cost? What is the result? What is the actual benefit of doing this? The Lubavitcher Rebbe's approach in 1970 was, these protests are well-intentioned, but they're very misguided. Let's go to text number 10a. Alan, would you like to read text number 10a?
Sure. The public protests against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or to at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past.
So the Rebbe felt that in this circumstance, the result of the protest and the demonstration was that the French president felt humiliated and insulted and doubled down on his original opposition against selling weapons to the state of Israel and to sell weapons to Libya. The Rebbe felt through quiet diplomacy, he was reachable. An agreement could have been arranged, concessions could have taken place, there could have been a positive result. Emotionally satisfying, yes, protesting, demonstrating, screaming, calling people anti-Semites, making them uncomfortable, feels good, but it does not necessarily work, and there may be better and smarter ways. A year later, the Rebbe continued to address this issue in text number 10b. Alan, if you could continue text number 10b, please.
Yes. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them. You are an anti-Semite, you are a thief, you are a murderer. Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings and wish to behave like human beings.
So there's a very important point here that the Rebbe is making. The Rebbe's position, and this position is based on the story of Yaakov and Esav, is the focus has to be what is the best way to accomplish our goal. Not what is the most emotionally satisfying, but what's the best way to accomplish the goal. It could be that sometimes protests and demonstrations is the best way to accomplish the goal. It could be sometimes violence is the best way to accomplish the goal. But the Rebbe says that's not our initial first response, even though it may be the most emotionally satisfying. It might be the correct response, but we have to think, what is the best way to accomplish the goal? And just calling people anti-Semites and getting in their face often will not work and will cause people to double down on their position, and it's going to backfire. And the Rebbe said that's what happened in 1970. The Jews felt excited. Look how we're flexing our muscles. But the president of France said, I'm insulted, I'm embarrassed, and I'm not dealing with you. Only later, when diplomacy was tried, was it actually effective. So sometimes the demonstrations might feel good, but they might not actually work. And now I want to share a video that relates to the demonstrations against Russia and getting the Soviet Jews out of Russia. So I'm going to try to share my screen again. Hopefully it is going to work. Can you hear and see? Yes?
Yep.
Dr. David Lukens is chair of the political science department at Touro College. For 20 years, he served on the staff of U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
There was no one more involved with Soviet Jewry than Lubavitch Rebbe. There's no one who knew more about it. I remember being Rebbe Joseph Soloveitchik Shir, 1970, when a question came up about going to demonstrations for Soviet Jewry. And Yoshe Bear said, go to Crown Heights and ask the Lubavitch Rebbe. He knows more about this than anyone. And I went to the Rebbe several times about Soviet Jewry with Senator Moynihan, without Senator Moynihan on his behalf. And we got a very exciting offer in 1985. An offer came through Max Kampelman, who was an American arms negotiator. The new Soviet leader Gorbachev wanted to revisit the issue of Soviet immigration. And virtually every organized Jewish group and Jewish leader in America told us, don't trust them, don't deal with them, no compromises, don't give in to anything. And two Gedolei Israel, both of whom usually identified in the extreme Litvische camp, both said, we will defer to the Lubavitch Rebbe on this. Deference, I will not use the names on videotape. Their families are still alive. And I went to Crown Heights. And the Rebbe said, reach out, cancel the next Soviet Jewry demonstration and tell them that's why you're doing it. And Senator Moynihan went to the Lion's Den. He went to the leadership of the Conference on Soviet Jewry, and he told them, gentlemen, ladies, it's time to reach out, cancel your demonstration. And the battle ensued that was somewhat awful. And the senator stuck to his guns and did not budge. And it worked, it succeeded. We sent a letter to the Soviets against the wishes of many Jewish groups. 57 United States senators signed that letter. I think I can tell you that letter was approved word for word by the Rebbe, because it was. My Rebbe, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, and the Lubavitch Rebbe both went over that letter and made suggestions and changes in it. It was a letter telling the Soviets that that we understood that they were interested in revisiting the issue of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and the Stevenson Amendment, and that which were amendments that barred the Soviets from receiving certain trade status unless they allowed full immigration. And if they were to show good faith, we would meet them part way, and Congress would be prepared to accommodate. And this, of course, this went against the wishes of the political right wing in America. It went against the wishes of the organized American Jewish community. The Lubavitch Rebbe was a das yochid throughout the years of demonstrations. The demonstrations were counterproductive, that they were a mistake. And yet that das yochid, my Rebbe, both Rav Yoshe Ber and Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, because they deferred to the Rebbe, agreed with him. And in the final analysis, Hubert Humphrey, Pat Moynihan, the senators I worked with, also felt that the Rebbe's approach was the approach, and the final analysis, it worked. I know I heard Henry Kissinger tell Senator Moynihan that if we listened to the rabbi, we would have gotten them out years earlier. Because this was the approach the Rebbe suggested in the 70s, and no one wanted to listen. They were too busy demonstrating in the streets and yelling names of the Russians instead of being willing to deal with them. And after that, you get Sharansky out. After that, you start getting a whole change, and then we get, thank God, millions of people out of the Soviet Union. And I think that aside from all the work the Rebbe did to keep Yiddishkeit alive in Russia, His contribution in the final opening up of the gates has never been fully appreciated or noted.
The Rebbe's position, oh, we gotta stop this for a second here. Going to hopefully get back the other screen. The Rebbe's position was not that demonstrations don't work, can't work, and should be outlawed. The Rebbe felt that he understood the Russian mentality, the Russian mindset. The Rebbe was Russian. He lived in Russia. He grew up in Russia. His father was imprisoned by the Russians. His father-in-law was imprisoned by the Russians. And he felt when we demonstrate, when we scream and yell in the streets, it may make us feel good, but it accomplishes not only nothing, but it's dangerous for the Jews in Russia. Because it was the Chabad Hasidim in Russia who were being persecuted and were being arrested, whose lives were being made miserable as a result of the demonstrations. The Soviets hated them, were insulted by them, and did not respond well to them. The Rebbe felt through negotiation, through diplomacy, that is the way that we're going to secure the release of the Jews from Russia. Right? So this was the Rebbe's approach when it came to the demonstrations about the Russian Jews. If you want to learn more about the Rebbe's approach, there's a chapter on it in the book, The Rebbe by Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. So he goes in a little bit more detail. Now, I want to give you another example where the diplomatic approach perhaps is the right approach. 1972, Jesse Helms is elected to the Senate from the state of North Carolina. For the next 10 years, he is one of the most anti-Israel senators. He votes against every single bill that could benefit Israel on any level, and it appears to be one of those senators that is aiding and abetting the enemies of the state of Israel. When Israel attacked Lebanon in 1982 in order to defend themselves, Jesse Helms got up on the floor of the Senate and said that America should break off relations with Israel. Staunch anti-Israel advocate in the Senate. In 1984, when Ronald Reagan was president, the United States adopted something called Education Day USA. It's something which takes place every single year from 1984 till today, where on the date of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Hebrew birthday is officially declared by the President of the United States Education Day USA, and it's a day dedicated to promoting education and positive values in the United States. So 1984, the very first Education Day USA, Chabad in Washington, D.C. holds an event. Many dignitaries, many politicians were at the event. One of the politicians who attended was Senator Jesse Helms. Alan Dershowitz, famous lawyer, professor from Harvard, he was either at the event or he heard about it, and he was very bothered. And he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe saying, how could it be that Chabad Lubavitch honored Senator Jesse Helms, one of the most anti-Israel people in the entire United States Senate? The Rebbe responded to Alan Dershowitz. The letter was 4 pages long. The Rebbe begins the letter, first of all, by saying, we did not honor him. He chose to attend, right? He walked in, we didn't honor him. In the PS of the letter, which was 1.5 pages long, this is what the Rebbe writes, text number 11. This is from the PS of the Rebbe's letter to Alan Dershowitz. Mark, would you like to read text number 11?
Sure. I trust you will agree that in regard to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, though I have never personally met the said person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions, depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite, however tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There is surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings toward Jews and Jewish causes.
The Rebbe makes the point that what do you gain from constantly labeling people anti-Semites? It might feel good to vent and to let out your frustration on these people, but does it actually result in anything good? Does anything good happen? What actually good and positive results from yelling and screaming, this senator, this congressman, this person is an anti-Semite, and et cetera, et cetera? What does it actually accomplish at the end of the day? You distance yourself from that politician, and that politician from ever doing anything good. Through cultivating a relationship with those politicians, through educating those politicians, there is a chance that you actually have the ability to change their mind, to win them over to your side. Even if not fully and completely, you never know when they are going to be that deciding vote, and there's a negotiation that to take place. Within 2 years of this 1984 meeting, of this 1984 event, when Jesse Helms came to that event, he became one of the biggest supporters of the state of Israel in the Senate, completely reversed his position. He was one of the biggest champions of giving foreign aid to the state of Israel when he previously opposed it. He was one of the biggest champions of Israel remaining control of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria, even though he previously opposed it. It might be very tempting to insult and to criticize and to call names, but at the end of the day, it usually doesn't accomplish something. And through cultivation and education, through diplomacy, very often we can have a powerful influence. Don't disregard the possibility of influence. Practically speaking, what are some takeaways from this idea that we could attempt to apply? Number one, we should be slower to name and shame and be quicker to engage and influence. Now, I'm not saying that there's never a point to shame and to call people anti-Semites. That's not what I'm saying. What we're saying is you have to judge what is the best way to achieve the goals that we want. We have goals that we want to achieve for the safety and security of the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and so on. We should be slow to name and shame. We may need to name and shame, but be slow to name and shame. Be quicker to engage and to influence, because this has worked and it may work. This is something which is relevant to all community leaders, politicians, community leaders in interacting, but not just to community leaders. This is something that is incredibly relevant to individuals as well. You may have encountered people in your life that have expressed anti-Semitic ideas and sentiments. You can make enemies of them, you can write them off, or you can choose to engage, to educate, to influence, and who knows what's going to happen. I want to give you an example. There is a man who's named Daryl Davis, African American, but he did not grow up in the United States because his parents were working for the United States government. He was raised in foreign countries where he went to school in a diplomatic school with kids of all kinds of nationalities. At the age of 10, he moves to Boston. And there is some type of parade, I can't remember, it might have been a school parade, some type of parade, he's marching in the parade, and all of a sudden things are thrown at him, and all kinds of racist remarks are directed at him. And he could not understand. He never knew until that point the concept of racism. He could not understand, how could it be, how could it exist? Just because you're a different color skin, they hate you. It bothered him, it hurt him to the core. And it influenced the rest of his life. He became a professional musician, right? Performed with some of the top musicians, top music acts all over the world. He was once in a bar and he had an encounter with a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And he started engaging in conversation with him. And the guy said to him, I never knew that a black person could play an instrument so well. Couldn't believe it. A black person could play so well? And he developed a friendship with this person. And over the years, until this very day, he has dedicated a major portion of his life to searching out, to seeking out, to befriending members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he has convinced well over 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan to leave the Ku Klux Klan, and they've given him their robes. There's a fabulous documentary on Netflix about him. I recommend you watch it. Here's just a few pictures. This is the leader of a Ku Klux Klan group giving him an award. He's actually giving him an award, right? A friend of the Ku Klux Klan. It's mind-boggling, right? Here he's actually attending a cross burning. He became the best friend of the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan of Maryland, right? Hanging out with this guy, hanging out with these people, talking to them, engaging them, going to barbecues with them. And he has a garage full of all these robes, which he's managed to get from people from the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, it's easy to say those Ku Klux Klan, bunch of evil, anti-Semitic, racist, hillbilly morons. Right? And you're right, you'd be 100% right for saying that. Will you accomplish anything besides letting off of steam? Diplomacy, cultivation, education. This man has had a huge effect on people who are fully committed to hatred in a very real and visible way. They wore robes, they burned crosses, they planned criminal activities. He got them out of it. And we could do that as well. We have to recognize that people can change and people do change. And we are able to have an effect on these people.
Lesson 4, Change of Heart. 1. The Torah's narrative of Jacob and Esau suggests that by employing the right words and deeds, we can influence those we deem to be against us. Accordingly, the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai traveled to Rome to win concessions for the benefit of the Jewish community, establishing a model followed by countless others, most famously the European court Jews of the early modern period. 2. Jews did not feel inferior while conducting diplomatic missions. They knew that the Jewish future depended on God, and that their job was to generate a garment behind which God could conceal his blessings. A firm belief that they were in God's hands inspired in them a sense of pride. 3. According to modern neuroscience, brains are built of multiple parts that weigh in concerning different choices, each part competing to control the single output channel of behavior. This explains why an individual with Jewish friends can nevertheless carry out a drunken tirade against Jews. Conversely, it explains why Jews can gain assistance from unlikely sources. 4. Today, we are finally able to campaign publicly against those who oppose us. However, it is often counterproductive to publicly brand individuals as enemies or anti-Semites. Slow to shame and quick to engage is still an effective route. 5. We must do everything possible to condition society to bring out the best in people rather than their more sinister elements. In the sphere of education, this means promoting an approach that is not restricted to acquiring information, but rather includes proper character traits, self-discipline, and the awareness that all humans are created to actively generate goodness in their environments. 6. Living in harmony with our fellow Jews enables us to better collaborate to ward off threats and promote our interests. Jewish mysticism teaches that God responds positively to Jewish unity, providing overt blessings of protection and goodness.
As always, you can continue learning about the topic of this class, myjlad.com/antisemitism. There's also further reading at the end of the textbook as well. And now we have a little promo, a preview of the next JLI course, which is going to begin, I believe, in the first week of February. Hopefully it's coming. It did not come. Okay, let's try this again. The media is unavailable. It doesn't want to play. Okay. All right. I will make sure that in the follow-up email to the course, the video plays for the promo for the next course. The next course is called Meditation from Sinai. The Torah was given at Sinai, so were the meditative tools to help us open up, see what's possible, and live deeply. Join us this winter for Meditations from Sinai, a course that teaches the what, the how, the why, the where, and when of divine meditation, mindful awareness, and soulful transcendence. Register today, not literally today because we don't have that available. Do not be confused to think that there's a course solely about meditation, Jewish style meditation, although we will cover it. There's going to be profound and important and deep Jewish ideas that are going to be conveyed in this class. So look forward to that. Meditation from Sinai. We'll get to that shortly. And now, if anyone has any, before that, anyone who needs continuing education credits, doctor, lawyer, psychologist, anything of that nature, please let me know so I can make sure you get the credits. So I know Phil, of course, needs the credits. Craig, is there anyone else who is a doctor or a lawyer who would like to get credits for attending this class? Right. If yes, let me know afterwards. Otherwise, as far as I know who needs the credits. All right, any questions? So it's not there, hold on a second. Any questions, comments on the material that we discussed? Yes, Karen.
You mentioned the KKK and musician documentary, but you didn't give us the name.
I cannot remember the name.
Okay, I'll just Google that then.
The guy's name is Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis, it'll come up right away. And it's, of course, on Netflix. And you could find a lot of information about him online. I was blown away, especially because I've always been fascinated by the Ku Klux Klan. In school, I did like a 10-page report on the Ku Klux Klan. And when I was about 14, I went to a Shabbaton in Lowell, Massachusetts. And the main speaker was a person who is in witness protection program with the FBI, who was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow.
And he described actual bombings and crazy stuff that they were involved with. And he scared the living daylights out of me about what the Ku Klux Klan is capable of. So to watch this documentary and see what a person was able to accomplish by reaching out and talking and speaking to someone. Most of these people never met a black person. They never met a Jew. They don't know it. Reach out, talk, befriend. Nothing happens overnight. And you never know what you're going to be able to accomplish. Because just yelling and screaming, it's fun, right? Saying things on Twitter, posting on social media, but does it actually accomplish anything? Does it do anything? That's the main thing. What are we actually accomplishing? That has to be the main focus. Yes, Alan.
Just two things. First of all, for a slightly different perspective on how people get to be anti-Semitic or whatever, there's a very good book called Caste, with an E on the end, that describes and investigates the comparison of castes in India, the Nazi attempt to create a caste of Jews as in effect, the untouchables, and compares it to the situation with African Americans here. And I just give you that because it's a really interesting book, and it touches on many of the same things. But the other thing I wanted to say is, there's a great deal of difference between generalizations about diplomacy is better than confrontation, and the fact that many of the things we talked about, particularly tonight, are not single cause and effect situations. For example, would Pompidou have moderated his position if there had not been some kind of negative reaction to begin with? If you didn't have a demonstration that said a lot of people are upset about this, would he have paid any attention? Normally, people accomplish something with diplomacy when there's a trade-off. I noticed a picture in the book about Oliver Cromwell dealing with a rabbi as to the permission to let Jews come back into Britain. If you remember the whole story, there were Jews in Britain. They were expelled back before the 1400s or during the 1400s. Cromwell leads the Puritan Revolution. Someone convinces him that the way they read whatever Puritan Bible it was, the Messiah will not have a second coming till there are Jews all over the world. And pitching that appealed to Cromwell's self-interest about bringing the second, his version of the second coming. That's how Jews were allowed to re-enter the British Isles. There's got to be some kind of trade-off. There's got to be something you can talk about in diplomacy. Otherwise, all you're doing is begging. And you're not going to find that many nice guys around, whether they're Arabs or anti-Semites or whoever. We're going to do it just out of the goodness of their hearts. You're going to have an iron fist inside the velvet glove. So I think that part is just sort of missed in this last chapter.
I think you make a very, very good point. I would agree with most of what you're saying, that there are multiple things that often play together and work together. The Rebbe's approach, again, based on the story of Yaakov and Esav, was that the goal has to be, right, our approach has to be, what is the best way that I'm going to actually be successful? And it may be through demonstrations and protesting. It might be through violence, right? It's very possible. And it could be a combination of both of those things. But the approach of demonstrations as being the way to go is not always correct. And sometimes it can actually backfire. Sometimes it could actually cause negative results. We're not advocating a one-way approach. The approach is diplomacy and nothing else, right? It could be a two-pronged approach. It could be one versus the other, but the mindset always has to be, what am I going to achieve? What is the method that I'm going to achieve the results that I want? Right? It's very easy to say, I'm going to be in your face. I'm going to stand up for myself. I'm not going to allow anti-Semites to dictate how I'm going to live. It might be very appealing and attractive to march. I'm standing up to the man and I got my poster and I got my placard and I got my loudspeaker. It may work, it may be helpful, and it could be a combination of the diplomacy that helps, but it's not the only solution and doesn't always work. And we have to be aware of that and try to balance what will actually achieve the goals that we want. But thank you. It's a very, very good point, Alan. Anyone else? You got to unmute yourself if you want to share something. Yes, Mitchell.
I was at the Save Soviet Jewry United States Washington D.C. rally that they had a coming with 1,000 Jews. It was held by the Federation. They set up a charter that was like 6 months, 5 months, whatever it was. My parents sent me on it as a gift that I should be able to go through it. It was definitely memorable.
Then one of my favorite songs is a Mordechai and David song, which goes, thousands shouting no, let my people go, enough of your pain. And it's a fabulous song. I'm all for this. I could imagine being a Jew feeling so proud that we are standing up and we are not allowing the Russians to hold a hostage to Jewish people. But the Rebbe's approach was that he knows the Soviets, and this just makes them stiff-necked, and they actually literally persecute Jews in Russia as a result. But if you sit down at the table and say, there's issues here, you guys need supplies, you guys need technology, you guys need food, right? The stuff that we can negotiate on, the stuff that we could talk about, that would have been a more effective strategy and would have been successful years earlier. Yes, Mark.
A fascinating topic. I'm curious, the selection of the Yaakov with compassion as the model for kind of engaging with anti-Semites, when I don't know, first question was, is Esau an anti-Semite? I don't know if that's too early to even define that like that. And second question was really related to, are there other models or other examples in the Torah where we have a different approach? And I'm thinking of kind of with the Amalekites, and there's other interactions that aren't with diplomacy. So just curious.
So first of all, 100%, there are tremendous amount of examples where we don't go with diplomacy. One of them, of course, was during the Holocaust. There was actually a mindset amongst many Jews in America during the Holocaust. You know, we don't want to say anything, we don't want to do anything, you know, we don't want to upset anyone. And, you know, that was clearly the wrong approach. There were demonstrations during the Holocaust in Washington, D.C., and there were many official representatives of Chabad who were there, right, that were sent by the Rebbe to be there and to participate in that demonstration. So absolutely, there are times where violence and demonstrations and protests are called for, which is why you can't say there's a blanket statement. Should you boycott Ben and Jerry's or whatever the thing that's out there? Should you call XYZ congressmen an anti-Semite because they are? I'm not advocating a blanket policy. Right? The policy is evaluate, look, and see. What is the way that we could achieve the desired goal and the outcome, the actual outcome that we want? Some situations demand the demonstration that will be successful and will work and will accomplish the goal. Other circumstances demand quiet diplomacy. It's not as fun, it's not as attractive. You're negotiating with people who really hate you. Who wants to do that? But that actually might be the best way to go sometimes. And Yaakov and Esav are the model, because in Jewish tradition, Yaakov and Esav don't just represent two individuals who lived 3,000 years ago. Yaakov is the father of the Jewish people, right? Esav is considered to be the father of Rome and the father of the West. My Parsha class from last week was actually on this topic and actually discussed this exact issue, that in the Torah portion, right after this confrontation between Yaakov and Esav, Esav says to Yaakov, let's travel together, right? Let's walk together. Let's be brothers. Let's walk like family. And Yaakov says, it's probably not a good idea. It's not going to work. You go on ahead and I'll catch up with you at Mount Seir. But they never catch up at Mount Seir. And the commentaries explain, you know why? Because the Jewish people, the descendants of Yaakov and the descendants of Esav, are still journeying, right? This is the story of Jewish history, the interaction between Yaakov and Esav, right? Sometimes there's anti-Semitism. Sometimes there's a genuine embrace. Sometimes there's a genuine warmth. Sometimes there's genuine affection. But other times that, you know, it's short-lived. So Yaakov and Esav represent the battle, the struggle between Jews and the Gentile world that we're going throughout history, and it's going to culminate with the Messianic era. You could check out the class on the Shul Center on YouTube. Go to the Shul Center, the Torah portion of Vayeshev. I recorded it on Monday and uploaded it.
So I have a question. So you were talking about World War II, so the Jews here in the States, but in Europe, did the rabbis have that, you know, diplomacy thing? Is that how they got sucked into what happened, being passive and thinking they could talk their way out of it? Is that what they think, or?
Yes, yes, I would say yes. It's very difficult, though, not that you're trying to, but it's very difficult to lay blame on various Jewish leaders at that time, because it was impossible for anyone to actually think that this is going to happen, right? For anyone to think that the Holocaust is going to happen, if you're 1930, 1935, it's very difficult for you to actually think it's going to happen. And when things started getting out of control, there was pretty much nothing that most of the Jews were able to do. But I would definitely say that most of the Jewish leaders at that time were very much influenced by this idea, much more along the lines of diplomacy or negotiation or not making trouble versus aggressive reactions and responses to it.
Right, not having the backup.
Yes, and it could very much be argued that serious mistakes were made. What could have been done, whether in Germany or Poland, I'm not sure, but certainly the United States had the ability to do so much. The United States could have saved millions of lives. Millions of lives the United States could have saved, and they did not do so. It was not a priority, right? I'm not ready to say anti-Semitism, although there may have been some who were, but it wasn't a priority. And the Jews in America at that time did not make it the priority. And if they would have made it the priority, perhaps there could have been some success. And I know that there were Jews who, part of the response to the Soviet issue was there were Jews who felt that we failed during the Holocaust. We are not going to fail our brothers and sisters that are in Russia. That did drive a lot of that activism. Again, all motivated by the most positive and wonderful things, and perhaps was somewhat effective. Diplomacy together with demonstrations perhaps is what ultimately was effective. But Marcus, you look like you want to say something, but you got to unmute yourself first. But no pressure.
Mute, okay.
There you go.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear, Marcus.
All right, right now, it's almost an instinct when you hear something anti-Semitic to react verbally or however, but you got people like BDS, for example, like the LA teachers want to condemn Israel. I mean, it was voted down, but all these groups are gaining more and more traction. What do you do about that on a big level?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a full and complete answer. I did mention in previous classes that the BDS movement needs to be called out for what it is, right? It needs to be called out for what it is. It is anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitism is evil. And I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to respond, because there are students who are on campus who all that they hear and all that they know is that perspective. And if it's not made clear to them in the clearest way possible that the choice is between evil, right, and not, they're not gonna, you have to catch their attention. So I do believe that you have to be able to do that. On the other hand, right, running and screaming anti-Semite is going to drive away perhaps as many people as you're going to welcome in. And I can tell you that my role as a Chabad rabbi on campus was to reach every single Jew as in any way that I possibly can. Do something positive, do something Jewish. By reminding them that they're Jewish, that's the best way to get them out of the BDS stuff, by actually doing a mitzvah with them. So as critical as I was of BDS, and in one-on-one conversations with BDS people, I did not run all over campus shouting, yelling, and screaming about BDS. All I would have accomplished is to make sure that no one will talk to me. Not only will BDS not talk to me, but also the Jewish students won't talk to me. So I had to make sure that I developed relationships with students and with professors, and we absolutely had a big effect, right? I told you in the previous class that when Norman Finkelstein spoke, the 60th anniversary of the State of Israel, and said Israel is the worst country on the face of the earth and all that stuff, and a Jewish student stood up and said, "Thank you so much for sharing the Jewish approach," right? That kid came to my house on Friday night all the time. Right? Later on in the year, we had a discussion about Israel. I let people share their perspective, whatever they want to say, and I shared my perspective. He needed a ride home. I drove him back to college to the dorm. He said that was the best discussion that he ever was at. He had a completely different tune by the time the year was over. Right? Another Jewish student, this one, his mother was Israeli, interestingly enough, but this was a guy involved and active in all this anti-Israel stuff. He came to my house almost every single Friday night for a year, almost every Friday night for 1 year. We never talked about Israel at the table in any political type of way. By the time the year is over, he was a completely different student. Why? Because he actually felt like he's part of the Jewish people. He felt like the state of Israel belongs to him. Right? Before, being Jewish was foreign, the state of Israel was foreign, and he had nothing to do with it. You actually develop that relationship, it completely changes things. So is there a single strategy to deal with BDS? I don't know. But it would appear that both of these approaches have a place. They have to be called out, they have to be condemned, and it would appear that actually placing pressure works, right? It does actually appear that placing pressure on some of these colleges and institutions and things works and is successful, and if that's the case, it should definitely be used. But at the same time, there's a lot of people out there develop that personal relationship, engage in the conversation, and you actually may be able to affect people in a positive way. Not overnight. 5 years, 10 years of regularly interacting with the professor might be a different person 5 to 10 years later.
Have they found that the birthright has been successful in, making some of the kids feel like they have a connection, or is it, how they've been doing it for many years now? I assume that's one of the reasons they extend that.
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that question. The reason that I say that is because there are many anti-Israel activists who sign up for the birthright trips just to get a free trip to Israel. And then they stay and they hang around in the Palestinian areas. Just as an example, I have a picture of a Jewish student at one of our Hanukkah parties eating a nice donut at the party. She went on a birthright trip to Israel. Again, there's many different types of birthright trips. There are ones who emphasize Jewish values and traditions, and there are other ones who take you to the nightclubs in Tel Aviv. It's like there's a very different approach. But she stayed on and participated with anti-Israel activists, and she came back to campus and made a huge display in one of the restaurants that were on campus and caused all kinds of anti-Israel stuff going on. And she's the one who had that quote that Hebrew has become the language of abuse. Right? Hebrew is a immoral, unethical language because that's the language which is used to persecute the Palestinians. And she got this from a birthright trip. So I'm not against birthright trips. I went on a birthright trip. I think birthright trips can be incredibly powerful and effective, but it depends who's running it. If the foundation of the birthright trip is Judaism and the holiness of the land of Israel, it can inspire a person tremendously. But if the approach is that Israel is just a country like any other country and we have fabulous nightclubs as well, then that message doesn't come across. And easily a person can get a free trip to Israel and hang out in Gaza or the West Bank and come out with a very different perspective.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I had one of mine went with Lubavitcher from Madison and the other went with Hillel from Milwaukee. And I have one now that ended up moving there. He loves it. But I think both of them, it opened up their eyes that they did, for them, so, but I don't know. I was just
going to Israel is probably the best eye opener that you possibly can have. But within the birthright trip, there's, we have to be aware. Some people use it as a free trip to Israel and it backfires.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much for joining us for this course. I hope that you found it meaningful, Sam, and relevant and food for thought. And we have 3 JLI courses a year, all kinds of different topics. And I hope that you'll join us again. And remember, every Tuesday night from 7:30 to 8 p.m., 30 minutes of Torah study, the same Zoom link as we use as always. For the next 2 Tuesdays, though, the class is going to be pre-recorded. It will not be live. Next Tuesday is the mega Hanukkah party at the yard at Bayshore, Geld drop, this whole deal. So there'll be no live class. And the next Tuesday, I'm at a bar mitzvah in New York. But the classes will take place. They're on the Shul's YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, the Shul Center. It's all going to be there.
By the way, Rabbi,
Yes.
when I took that